In this lesson, we are learning about the Reconstruction period, which is the period of rebuilding that followed the Civil War. So here is where the Reconstruction period begins, where the Civil War leaves off. The Civil War legacy, remember, was that many southern cities were devastated, and the South lost 250,000 soldiers in the battles of the Civil War. The South's economic institutions were devastated because all the free labor was gone, and slavery was dead, and absolutely no one knew what to do with that or how to replace it. So here's where we are politically at this point as we're going into the Reconstruction period. The Civil War had destroyed prosperity and had especially impacted the political dynasty known as the family in the state. Remember the Seviers, the Conways, the Rectors, the Johnsons. Those people had dominated really since territory times, and so now suddenly they are out of power. Reconstruction begins actually in 1863, before the Civil War ends, but it begins with Lincoln's proclamation of amnesty and Reconstruction, his 10% plan. Lincoln's 10% plan would offer a full pardon for states that would pledge loyalty to the Union, and they would have to accept the end of slavery. And so as far as where the 10% comes in there, the idea was that 10% of the people who voted in the 1860 election would have to pledge loyalty to the Union. So that's where the 10% comes in. We don't know if it would have worked or not because Lincoln was assassinated, and his vice president, when he became president at the end of Lincoln's life, didn't go with it because he was a Southern Democrat himself. So he really kind of leaned more toward the Democrats rather than the Republican Party. So Lincoln's 10% plan never really went into action. Also in Arkansas politics, the Democratic Party, which was still a very minor party at this time, and the Whigs form a conservative party, and they're able to take control of the election of 1864, which again is still in wartime during the Civil War. And the period of Reconstruction then, once the war ends, Reconstruction brings Unionists not only into Arkansas, but into the government control of Arkansas. And along with these Unionists, other people are starting to work to try to reclaim power that they lost. So we still have a power struggle despite the fact that the Civil War has ended. So I mentioned as we got started in this lesson that suddenly, at the end of the Civil War, slave labor was gone, and people didn't know what to do with that. The obvious answer is that you pay people a fair wage to do a job, but, that's not something that they had been doing. So if you're the plantation or large farm owner, now you have to have money to pay people to do the work for you that you had not been paying before. It definitely cuts into your profit margin. So people are not going to make a lot of money when they go to work. These former slaves are not going to make decent money now that they are freed. One of the parts of rebuilding the economy that came up was sharecropping, and this was one solution to lack of slavery. So sharecropping would allow a farmer to rent a plot of land that they could farm independently. Now, depending on who furnished the tools, sometimes the farm owner would furnish all the tools, sometimes the sharecropper would furnish some of the tools. Generally, though, it was the farm owner that had plenty of tools on hand. So these sharecroppers were renters of land, they were renters of tools, and the way they repaid for their rent and tool use was by giving their landowner half of the crop. So there are a lot of problems with that. I mean, what if your crop doesn't make? What if there's a drought and your crop doesn't grow? Or what if there's a flood and your crop doesn't grow? So you can see it's really easy to end up owing a lot of money in that kind of situation. Another problem was that it was really easy for these plantation owners or large farm owners to cheat these freedmen, the former slaves, because they were largely illiterate because, slaves weren't allowed to learn or to have an education. So it was really easy to say, "Oh yeah, well, you only have to pay you for this pound of cotton," when maybe they'd actually brought in 5 pounds of cotton and they couldn't read to know. So that's why the Freedmen's Bureau was so important to offer literacy and education. Literacy and education was important for the adults, also for the children, but in addition to reading, writing, and some basic math, we're not talking anything like algebra or geometry or any of that. We're talking basic reading, writing, and basic math skills. The Freedmen's Bureau also taught skills like homemaking, or skills that could be used in a domestic setting too, so that would help people who maybe hadn't been in the workforce, like maybe some of the women who had been slaves inside a home to do cooking or cleaning, that kind of domestic labor, that they would get official training for that, and then they could go get jobs doing that for other people. So the Freedmen's Bureau was very, very important in that regard. Despite the fact that everything has changed about labor, cotton returns as the main money crop. Now, cotton had a problem in a lot of states across the South because the war did devastate so much as far as land and that sort of thing, but also definitely impacted by drought too. And cotton does reemerge though, and we still refer to cotton as king cotton, that it was the main crop of the South. So still needed a lot of people to work it, just like they did pre-Civil War. So let's talk about some of the attitudes going into Reconstruction. Remember, the radical Republicans were the people largely influential in the North that before the Civil War and during the Civil War believed that the South absolutely must free the slaves. These are the people who very much radical in that regard. Now remember, the term radical Republican is not a slur in any kind of way. This is what the term was that they used for themselves. They were the radical Republicans, radical in the way that they demanded change. So the radical Republicans believed all along that the South absolutely must free the slaves, and that the North must absolutely help the slaves that fought for them in the war, and that the slaves should be given voting rights. And now these people continue to have great influence in Congress, and at this point during Reconstruction, since they have a large influence in Congress, they now have great influence over the former Confederate States of America. So make no mistake, all the while Arkansas is undergoing Reconstruction, members of the family are looking for ways to get back into power. And they won't be happy until they do get back into power. So they're very much threatened by Reconstruction, especially radical Reconstruction, because it pulls them out of power altogether. There are new constitutions that are developed. There's universal male suffrage. That means that all men can vote, and that includes black men. And that is something that the white Southerners in Arkansas, especially those from the previous Democratic Party, were not happy about, especially the family. They ratified the 14th Amendment, and the hard part for these former politicians was that the former Confederate members, the people who participated in the Confederate government, were not allowed to participate in the radical Reconstruction government. So there's no way they could have any kind of influence in state politics, and it really drove them nuts. Not because they liked power so much, but because that was their money. You know, from the very beginning, when these people were coming in as surveyors and kind of giving people benefits as far as great plots of land and that sort of thing because they were friends of the family or they were family, all of that leads to money. So these people are very much trying to regain control so that they have that financial power that they used to have. And I want to mention here too, there are a couple of terms that you hear when talking about Reconstruction: scalawags and carpetbaggers. So carpetbaggers were white Northerners who came to the South during Reconstruction looking for an opportunity to become someone, to kind of earn a place in society, maybe to start a business, to get involved in politics where maybe they hadn't exactly been political before. These are people from the North who are coming to the South hoping to profit off of this whole idea of Reconstruction. And they're called carpetbaggers because they had fancy bags, like they were made out of tapestry, which is kind of a carpet, so that's where carpetbaggers come from. And scalawags, if someone called you a scalawag, actually a scalawag or a carpetbagger from the South, it was definitely a slur. But scalawags were the white Southerners who previously supported the Union. So during the war, they were on the side of the North. So these people were called scalawags. So the new constitutional delegates that are selected under radical Reconstruction are 23 white Southerners who are scalawags, former Union supporters, and 17 white Northerners who are carpetbaggers, people who have come here to get involved in politics or to get involved for a profit. So this constitutional convention at the state level, these 23 scalawags and 17 Northerners, carpetbaggers, who worked together to put together Arkansas's Reconstruction Constitution, gave all males the right to vote, including black males, and made sure that the Constitution for the state focused on equality in all terms of the law. Now, when I say that, I'm talking about male equality, okay? Equality in all terms of the law for all men, regardless of race, color, or previous servitude. And you couldn't forbid any rights or privileges based on those things either: race, color, or previous servitude. So, they couldn't say, well, since you have been a slave in the past, you don't get to vote now. Now, what does happen, though, this loophole that comes about and that actually starts to lead toward the Jim Crow laws that we've mentioned already, but this loophole of a grandfather clause. Now, these days, if we talk about a grandfather clause, someone's grandfathered in, it generally means that if you've already been participating in something, this new law won't impact you. But in this particular case, the grandfather clause referred to if your grandfather or father could vote before 1867, so could you. Well, guess who that leaves out? It leaves out a lot of freedmen because their fathers and grandfathers were slaves. So that's something that comes about. It's not embedded in this Constitution, but it eventually comes up and is added or is practiced as a loophole as the family and the Southerners start to regain power during the Redemption period. Another part of the radical Reconstruction Constitution was free education, and that was for everyone. So free education. And then Arkansas, after approving this Constitution, was readmitted to the Union on June 22nd, 1868. In the election for governor in 1868, Powell Clayton was elected. He was a federal cavalry member from Kansas, and he started out as a Democrat, but he changed before the war because he disagreed with all the violence and the hostility toward blacks. So He started out politically as a Democrat, but switched because of the violence. He didn't like where that was headed. Clayton actually helped create the Republican Party in Arkansas in 1867, and he ran the government office like he ran a military campaign. Basically, that was his previous experience. So, the more military it was, the more comfortable he was. He was very aggressive, and he appointed a Republican-dominated legislature. Obviously, that would help him get laws passed that would help during Reconstruction. This was another setback for the family and Arkansas Democrats. But as I mentioned, from the very beginning, Democrats were trying to regain control of their state government, and this election of 1868 was no different. One of the things that was happening that was to help the Democrats regain control was the Klan. The Ku Klux Klan developed and implemented terroristic tactics across the state to intimidate and even kill African Americans, Republicans, and Unionists. So those carpetbaggers and scalawags were not safe either. So we had the Klan, who was threatening people and actually hurting people, to try to help the Democrats regain control, to make people afraid to go to the polls to vote Republican. Klan violence impacted voter registration and was seen as an obstruction of justice at the time. So Governor Clayton sent state troops, but the violence was a full outbreak, and we'll look at that in just a minute. Actually, I think it's here on the next slide, so let's move ahead. The violence surrounding the election of 1868 resulted in what is now known as the Militia War, and it was a response to that wave of violence that swept across the state after the adoption of the Constitution of 1868, and with Clayton's organization of the militia. So only eligible voters could serve in the state militia. At the time, there was not a state militia, so Clayton had to organize that. He reorganized it and allowed only eligible voters to serve. So based on the 1868 Constitution, most of those who could serve would be African American or Unionist, because people who had participated in the former Confederate states were not allowed to participate in government right away, because the idea was to pull control from those people, rebuild, and then kind of set it free later. So we have a state militia that's going to be built by African American and Union volunteers. The problem is the federal government didn't send guns, they didn't send funding for guns, they didn't allow loans for them, there was no help from other states. Clayton even asked other states if they could borrow guns, and the answer was no. So Clayton ordered guns for the army, knowing full well that if the legislature didn't agree to fund these guns, that he was going to have to pay for them out of pocket himself. So he orders the guns in order to fund this militia, or in order to arm this militia that he's putting together. The Democratic newspapers across the state know that this is happening, and so they call on cargo ships to boycott and to refuse to carry the guns into the state. But when the steamboat Hesper was determined to be the one that was actually carrying this shipment of guns, it was attacked after leaving Memphis, and the cargo on board was destroyed. Okay, so remember, it's election time, and the Klan and other attempts at violence were causing problems in some districts. So Governor Clayton declared that voter registration was not even possible in 14 counties. So he said that votes from those 14 counties would not be counted. Then he declared martial law. So the militia responded, the state militia responded without arms. They didn't have guns, They had no uniforms. I say they had no guns. They had no guns supplied by the state. If they were lucky, they had a personal gun. So they largely responded without arms, no uniforms, no supplies. They got food where they could. They took it where they had to. A lot of times they would take items from citizens and they would leave receipts behind so that, these people would have something in order to get reimbursed by the state, but most of the time the state did not honor those receipts. So this looks bad. It looks like the state is pillaging from its citizens with their militia. The first troop was gathered in Murfreesboro, and it was an all-white militia, and their goal was to move toward Center Point to search for weapons. Everyone needs weapons, so they're looking for weapons there. On November 14th, the state militia encounters a group of armed citizens, and they have a skirmish. There were 8 citizens and 1 soldier killed, and 60 citizens were captured as prisoners of war. These state militia soldiers were joined by a black militia troop while moving south, again looking for more weapons, and they arrested some people who were accused of Klan participation. They even executed a man who was accused of killing 2 government agents and a freedman. It really created an us versus them mentality, because we have armed citizens who are fighting to protect what they believe to be theirs, and we have a state militia going in to fight to protect what they are told to protect. So each troops, or each side, accused the other of various atrocities. Also, in terms of the militia war, there were 3 black troops organized for the state militia in Monticello who went on to execute a Klan member who was accused of murdering a deputy and a freedman. And Northeast Arkansas saw a lot of very violent acts against freedmen and white Republicans, and that would be the upper Delta area. Daniel Upham led a militia of 100 men. The local citizens formed their own militia of 200. So they're outnumbered. The state militia already is outnumbered 2 to 1. So Upham decides to handle it the only way he knows, which is he tells his men to take 15 citizens from that area as hostages. And those hostages then are used as negotiating power in order to put down this rebellion. They used the hostages to keep the Klan from attacking, and the governor forced the Klan to disband in order for this state militia to release those citizen hostages. That happened a month later. So with one political party so dominantly in charge, you would think that there wouldn't be a lot of problems. However, there were, just like there were problems and schisms between the Democrats when they were in charge. But the Republican leaders are trying to bolster the economy, and they're offering free public school. The first state university starts during this time period of Reconstruction, the University of Arkansas at Fayetteville. As a plus, 650 miles of railroad track are added in the state, which is a good thing. It helps with transportation and also helps in terms of commerce, because you can ship things easier now with more railroad track to work from. But there were inadequate finances. Again, as far as the guns went for the militia, if the federal government wouldn't fund that, then they're also not funding a lot of other things. So there are inadequate finances at the state level, some mismanagement, some corruption, and very definitely partisanship. So people are very Democrat or very Republican. Bipartisanship is a good thing. It's when people work together basically regardless of the party. They compromise. But partisanship was very strong at this period of time, and it ends up actually splitting the Republican Party. So now, not only Do the Democrats want to regain power of the state government? So does a new group referred to as the Liberal Republicans. The Liberal Republican Party begins in 1869 and they oppose Clayton and what they see that he stands for. Their party platform is that they want to end corruption and limit the governor's powers. Now, Governor Clayton had a lot of powers, or took a lot of powers. So they want to end that. They want to end voting restrictions on those former members of the Confederate States of America Army, and they want greater economy and government. In the 1872 election, the Liberal Republicans actually have a candidate on the ballot. They nominate Joseph Brooks for governor. And in the 1872 election, the Republicans nominate Elijah Baxter for governor. So we have the Liberal Republican candidate Brooks and the Republican candidate Baxter. So in the election of 1872, there is a lot of voter fraud because the Republicans controlled the election machinery. Baxter was declared the winner. Baxter, the Republican candidate. Brooks, the Liberal Republican candidate, refused to accept these election results. And groups form around each candidate to kind of continue the fight. And does that sound familiar? So while these two men weren't exactly fighting each other constantly after this election, because Baxter won and Brooks lost, they did have these groups that were still fighting, very much fighting on their behalf. Brooks kind of takes the court method, and he finally gets a circuit judge to reopen his complaint about voter fraud. And 10 months after the election, this circuit judge determines that Brooks should have been declared the winner and now declares him governor. So, in a way, we have two governors at one time. We have Baxter, the Republican governor, and then we have Brooks, who gets the circuit judge to say, no, you're the governor. So this whole fight over the Brooks and Baxter war, this kind of schism between these two men and their political followings, really lasts a couple of years. It doesn't end until 1874. But so Baxter was elected governor, but suddenly the circuit judge says, no, Brooks is governor. So Brooks' supporters storm the Capitol and physically force Baxter to leave the office so that they can move Brooks in. Fighting begins among supporters. They organize militias. They have several battles along the way. A couple of those are listed here: New Gascony near Pine Bluff and Palarm near Faulkner, Pulaski County line. And it gets to the point that the United States President has to intervene. U.S. Grant intervenes and declares support for Baxter, who was the originally elected governor of, ironically, the same party. So the President gets involved and orders the Brooks forces to disband, and that finally ends the Brooks and Baxter War. And it's actually the election of 1874 that finally ends Reconstruction. The election of 1874 is the first state election since those restrictions ended on the former members of the Confederacy that were not able to participate in government. Now they can again. So the election of 1874 actually elects a Democrat, Augustus Garland, as the governor. Democrats were elected to more than 70 of the 91 positions open in the state. And the state votes to write a new constitution. The Constitution wants to limit state power of taxation and greatly limits the power of the governor. And the state legislature is Democratic control in both houses. Again, the first time since the Civil War or since the Reconstruction period began. But prosperity still was difficult until the second Reconstruction that actually comes about in the 1950s and 60s. That wraps up this look at the Reconstruction period of Arkansas.